Okay, let's unpack this. What is it about brushing up against, well, the edge of existence? It sparks these really consistent but still deeply mysterious stories.
Right.
I mean, for centuries, we've heard tales from people who've glimpsed something else, these near-death
And
experiences.
what's so fascinating, really from the get-go, is how similar they are.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't seem to matter where you are in the world or, when in history we're talking about,
Mm-hmm.
you get these recurring themes. People feeling like they've floated out of their body,
Got a body thing, yeah.
traveling through maybe a dark space or a tunnel,
Mm.
seeing an incredibly bright light.
Mm.
Then there's the life review, like your life flashing before your eyes.
Right, the whole life review.
And sometimes connecting with loved ones who've already passed. It's a surprisingly universal pattern, really.
Absolutely. And that pattern is exactly what we're diving into today. Our mission here is to figure out what our sources are telling us about these near-death experiences and DEs. We're going to look at the science, trying to unravel what's happening in the brain.
And also the other side, the different ways religions and even secular views interpret these moments.
Exactly. We've looked at a whole range of stuff, brain research findings, summaries of religious texts, some really compelling personal accounts.
And it's important, I think, right at the start to just acknowledge this stuff is mysterious. It touches on really deep personal beliefs.
For sure.
So our aim isn't to, prove or disprove any one thing. It's more about shedding light on the different perspectives, what the sources say.
Yeah, just laying it out there, giving you, the listener, a clearer picture of how NDEs are being explored without getting totally bogged down in every single detail.
Precisely.
So let's kick off with the science, because I think for a lot of people, the first question is just, what is happening in the brain?
Makes sense. And the scientific work is yielding some genuinely interesting results.
Like what?
Well, think about cardiac arrest. The heart stops. Blood flow to the brain basically stops almost immediately.
Right. Lights out, you'd think.
You would think.
Mm.
But here's the twist. Research, especially from people like Dr. Sam Parnia, shows that brain activity doesn't just, flatline instantly.
Yeah.
No, there can be this brief but significant surge in brain waves, particularly gamma waves.
Gamma. Okay, remind me. Gamma is linked to consciousness, high-level processing.
That's right. Intense focus, integrating information, things like that. So this spike may be lasting up to 30 seconds after the heart stops.
30 seconds?
Yeah. It suggests a final kind of powerful burst of mental activity, of awareness.
Okay, 30 seconds. That's actually quite a long window in brain time, especially under those conditions. Could that burst explain the vividness, the detail people report, like a last flare of consciousness?
That's definitely one major hypothesis. This final surge could generate these really intense, structured experiences. But there's more. Scientists are also looking at how the brain under extreme stress,
It's like lack of oxygen, hypoxia.
exactly, hypoxia or major trauma,
Mm-hmm.
how it might slip into a state that's weirdly similar to REM sleep,
Mm-hmm.
dream sleep, but while the person is technically still awake.
So a dreamlike state brought on by the brain basically freaking out could explain some of the stranger stuff. The life review, maybe? Or that feeling of floating?
Precisely. The brain fighting to survive might just create these incredibly vivid, almost hyper-real scenarios.
Oh, okay.
And then there's the whole brain chemistry angle near death.
Yeah.
Animal studies have pointed towards a natural release of chemicals that act a lot like DMT.
DMT, the psychedelic. Wow, okay.
Yeah, a very potent compound.
Yeah.
And the link is, well, the similarities between DMT trips and NDE reports are pretty striking.
How so? What kind of parallels are we talking about?
People who've taken DMT often talk about brilliant lights, this overwhelming sense of peace,
Mm-hmm.
and even meeting what feel like distinct beings or entities. These are all classic NDE elements.
Right.
So some researchers wonder if this could be like a biological mechanism, something built in to maybe ease the dying process, make it less traumatic for the brain with this sense of peace or a kind of pre-scripted journey.
It's like the brain has its own comfort mechanism for the end, a sort of internal light show and transcendence package when things get critical.
Yeah.
What else is science looking at? Any other brain regions involved?
Another key player seems to be the temporal lobe, especially the right side.
Okay, temporal lobe, memory, emotions.
The memory emotion, yeah, and also those feelings we often label as spiritual or mystical. And research shows that when the temporal lobe is disrupted, maybe through damage or a seizure or even just lack of oxygen,
Mhm.
it can trigger sensations that sound a lot like parts of NDEs. Feeling detached from your body, sensing a presence, intense emotions, even without any, religious background.
So it could be a kind of like neurological signal getting crossed, a misfiring causing these
It's a
flips.
plausible mechanism, yes.
Yes.
But, and here's where it gets trickier. You have researchers like Dr. Bruce Grayson, and he points to these NDE cases where people report incredibly detailed things, stuff they seemingly shouldn't know.
Like events happening elsewhere while they were unconscious.
Exactly. Verifiable details. And sometimes this happens when medical instruments show very little brain activity, maybe even none that's detectable.
That does throw a wrench in the purely brain-based idea, doesn't it? It really brings up that huge, difficult question. Could consciousness somehow exist apart from the brain?
It absolutely raises that fundamental question, the mind-brain relationship. Are they strictly the same thing? And that's still fiercely debated in the scientific world.
Okay. So if we try to sort of synthesize the scientific view, where does that leave us right now? What's the general consensus, if there is one?
I'd say the dominant scientific perspective is that NDEs are almost certainly real subjective experiences.
Okay, real to the person having them.
Absolutely. Triggered by these extreme conditions the brain is under near death.
Yeah.
But interpreting what those experiences actually mean, that remains wide open. Science can point to possible brain events, chemical releases.
The mechanisms.
Right, the mechanisms. But it can't definitively say if these experiences point to something, beyond the physical.
Okay, that makes sense. A really fascinating scientific picture, but with big questions still hanging. So while science gives us these potential brain-based explanations, the meaning people take from NDEs often connects to bigger frameworks, beliefs, worldviews.
Exactly.
Let's shift gears then. How do different religions or even secular viewpoints make sense of these experiences?
Well, it's quite remarkable how often someone's existing beliefs seem to color how they understand and talk about their NDE.
They interpret it through that lens.
Very much so. Take Christianity, for instance. With core beliefs in heaven and hell, an NDE is often seen as, well, a glimpse of the afterlife.
An encounter with God, maybe?
Yeah.
Or angels. Judgment.
Precisely. It can really reinforce their faith in the soul surviving death, confirming what their scriptures teach. Although it's worth noting, different Christian denominations might view NDEs slightly differently, some fully embracing them, others perhaps a bit more cautious, wondering if they're purely psychological or even potentially misleading.
Interesting nuance there. What about Islam? How do Islamic traditions view them?
In Islam, the belief in Akhira, the afterlife, is absolutely central. So NDEs might be interpreted within that framework, perhaps as an early encounter with the angels Munkar and Nakir.
Who are they?
According to tradition, they're the angels who question the soul about its faith and deeds right after death. So an NDE could be seen as sort of a preliminary stage of that.
Okay. And moving east, what about Hinduism or Buddhism?
Well, Hinduism, with its concepts of reincarnation and karma, might see an NDE as, say, a visit to Yamaloka, the realm of the dead, maybe even meeting Yama, the god of death. And you actually hear NDE stories that fit quite well with some Hindu narratives, like someone being told it's not your time yet and being sent back.
Right, that specific message.
Exactly. And then in Buddhism, the focus is more on samsara, the cycle of rebirth and nirvana, liberation. Death is a transition.
Yeah.
So an NDE could be viewed as consciousness getting very close to making that transition, but then pulling back into the physical body.
It really does seem like people map these intense experiences onto their existing spiritual roadmap. What about indigenous spiritualities, shamanic traditions?
Yeah, many indigenous cultures view death not as an end, but as a journey through spiritual worlds, often with guidance from spirits, ancestors, nature forces. And actually, the death and rebirth experiences that shamans sometimes report during deep trance or ritual, they often share striking similarities with NDE elements. It suggests this is a really old cross-cultural human theme exploring that boundary between life and death.
Fascinating parallel. Okay, but what about people who don't subscribe to any religion? Atheists, secular folks. How do they process NDEs?
Well, interestingly, people with secular worldviews often report the same core NDE elements: the light, the peace, that feeling of connection.
But they frame it differently.
Exactly. They tend to describe it in non-religious terms, maybe feeling like they were merging with the universe or experiencing just pure, unconditional love, but without attributing it to a specific deity.
I see.
And some neuroscientists actually use this similarity across believers and non-believers as kind of evidence for the brain-based explanation. They argue it shows NDEs are a fundamental brain phenomenon, and the religious interpretation gets layered on top later based on your background.
So the core experience might be universal, but the label we put on it depends entirely on our pre-existing map of reality. It really highlights that core tension, doesn't it? Are NDEs proof of something spiritual, or are they brain events we interpret culturally?
That's the crux of the debate, absolutely. And it's likely to continue. But stepping back for a moment, let's just revisit those common threads we keep mentioning. What are the key things that pop up again and again in these accounts?
Well, like our sources keep showing, it's those core things we mentioned at the top, really. That feeling of being outside the body. Right. Moving through a tunnel or some kind of void. The
Yeah.
big one. Encountering that incredibly bright, often described as loving light.
Mm-hmm. An overwhelming sense of peace, usually. No pain.
Yeah, profound peace. The life review, seeing your life flash by, meeting others, often deceased relatives, or sometimes spiritual figures.
And that feeling of not wanting to come back.
Yes, that reluctance to return to the physical body is a really common theme. It felt too good, too peaceful there.
And beyond the experience itself, what's really striking are the long-term changes, the after effects.
Ah, yes, the transformation people report.
Exactly. And this seems to happen whether they interpret the NDE religiously or scientifically. People often report these profound positive shifts in their lives. We saw one account, didn't we, where someone completely changed their life path.
Yeah, someone totally career-focused, just dropped it all, started volunteering, helping others after their NDE. It completely rewired their priorities.
That kind of shift isn't uncommon.
Really?
What other changes do people typically report?
A really big one is losing the fear of death. Often, like completely.
Yeah, a significant reduction in death anxiety is very common.
And also just an increase in empathy, compassion, kindness towards others, a stronger sense of purpose, maybe. Like life has more meaning now.
Absolutely. Increased altruism, a greater appreciation for life, a stronger sense of connection to others and the world. These transformative effects are reported so consistently. It suggests that, whatever the ultimate origin or meaning is, the impact of an NDE can be incredibly real and positive.
So trying to pull all these threads together, it seems NDEs are just these incredibly complex experiences,
Mm-hmm.
multi-layered.
Yeah. We've got these potential scientific explanations rooted in how the brain reacts under extreme stress.
Hypoxia, chemical releases, temporal lobe activity.
Right. But then how people actually understand and make sense of that experience is deeply shaped by their personal beliefs, their culture.
That seems to be the key takeaway. The brain provides the potential event, but the mind, the culture, provides the meaning. And that fundamental question, do NDEs point to something beyond our physical understanding, beyond the brain? That remains a question, an ongoing discussion, and maybe a matter of personal interpretation.
Precisely. Science can describe, but it can't necessarily prescribe the ultimate meaning for everyone.
Okay, so on that note, maybe a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on. Given how consistent these reports are, these core elements, and given the profound, often positive life changes that follow, regardless of the explanation someone chooses, what might NDEs ultimately be telling us? What might they reveal about consciousness itself, about our search for meaning, or even just our relationship with death?
Yeah, big questions.
Definitely food for thought. We hope you'll consider all the different perspectives we've touched on in this deep dive, and maybe continue your own exploration into this really fascinating, enduring mystery.